Hey, this is Julien with Keller Realty, and I want to talk to you today about 3 specific contingencies that are part of or can be part of a real estate purchase agreement that is very important for you to understand and to be familiar with in the current market today. Whether you're a buyer or a seller, it doesn't matter. You need to know specifically about these 3. Now, these aren't the only contingencies that can be part of a contract, but specifically these 3 are very important to understand. So the first one of those 3 is the inspection contingency. Now, I always tell folks the inspection contingency is essentially your get out of jail free card if you're the buyer. What does that mean? That means that basically the purpose of that contingency is to give the buyer time to do all of their due diligence on the property. So whatever inspections they want to have done on the property, they do that within the transcribed or prescribed inspection contingency time frame. Now, the standard time frame is 17 days on the contract, but that's never typically what folks offer. So usually it's going to be somewhere between 7 to 14 days or so. Now, that being said, in the current market, a lot of folks are extremely shrinking that contingency period or waiving it completely. So what does that mean? So if you decide to waive your inspection contingency, which I must say is never, ever, ever going to be recommended by a broker for strictly liability purposes, and I'm explaining to you why. If you decide to waive your inspection contingency as a buyer, you obviously have a right to do that. If you decide to do that, what you're doing is you're removing the opportunity for you to exit the contract and get your full earnest money deposit back if you find an issue with the home, related to, condition, inspection, etc. So let's say, you waive an inspection contingency and then you inspect the home and you find out it needs a new roof. Well, guess what? That needs a new roof problem is now your problem to own. And then you have to make a decision. Do I back out of the contract and lose my earnest money deposit, which typically will be somewhere between 2 and 3% of the purchase price of the home? Or do I proceed and just have to deal with the roof problem after I purchase it? Now, some buyers think that, hey, because I paid well above the listed price and I gave the sellers everything they wanted in the original offer and I waived my inspection contingency, that if I find a major issue, I can ask really nicely and the sellers will, they'll help me out. No, that never works. Ever, never, ever works. The seller has no obligation whatsoever to do any sort of repairs to the home if you waive your inspection contingency. And if you happen to exit the contract as a result of it, let's say it's $1 million purchase and you put a 3% earnest money deposit down, that means you have $30,000 that's sitting in escrow that if you exit the contract because of an inspection problem, but you don't have a contingency in place, that $30,000 is now in the seller's hand and the seller has a right to claim that money. Now, of course, that can become a big court battle and we want to avoid those. But basically, if the buyer walks away with no inspection contingency for an inspection reason, the seller has a right to claim that money that's sitting in escrow, claim that earnest deposit money. So it's very important for buyers to understand what it means when you waive an inspection contingency. And it means that whatever you find out about the house, it's your problem resolved once you become the owner of that home. And if you decide you don't want to become the owner of that home, it's going to cost you whatever you put forth as your earnest money deposit, which, as I mentioned, is 2 to 3%. So that's very important. Now, the other thing that we're seeing folks do with their inspection contingency is shrink it, extremely shrink it. 7 days is a fairly common number. 10 days is another one. Now, the challenge that can arise out of that is, hey, can you have all of the inspections that you need to have done completed during that time frame? Now, typically, a home inspection is the first one that you want to have done, and home inspectors often are booked about a week out. So if you're thinking about extremely shrinking that time frame, you may either want to pre-book or reach out to a few different home inspectors to find someone that's available in the next few days so you can get that home inspection done right away. And the reason you want to get that done right away is because if that home inspection calls out anything else, or you need some sort of follow-on inspection or follow-on professional to come take a look at something, whether it be electrical, plumbing, roofing, etc., hopefully that'll give you enough time to do that. So that's just something to keep in mind. 10 days is usually doable. I do 10 days all the time, always makes it work, but that's just something you need to be conscious of and aware of. The next contingency that we want to talk about is the appraisal contingency. Now, this is a hot topic right now in today's market because many buyers are completely waiving their appraisal contingency in order to get their offer accepted. Other buyers that cannot afford to waive their appraisal contingency just don't have the cash to do so, don't have the debt to income ratio with the lender to do so. They're offering some sort of appraisal gap coverage in order to get their offer accepted. And I can tell you, in the last 6 months, there has only been one offer that I've been able to get accepted that didn't offer one of these two options. So it's obviously very common to put those in place, and you need to understand how that works. Now, when it comes to appraisal, the way that works, the purpose of the appraisal is to protect the lender from you buying a home that's not worth what the purchase price says it's worth. Now, that being said, in this market, due to the rapid appreciation that we've seen in the last 6 months, we've seen the market value of homes outpace the appraised value of homes. And the reason for that is because the appraiser is always looking backwards. Where the market is current, it's present, it's right now. So if you're looking back a month, 2 months, 3 months at, the closest comps you can find, the values that you find when you're looking backwards, since the market is moving so fast and it's appreciating so rapidly, it's not going to support the value that's in the current market today. And everyone understands that, and that is why we're seeing most offers come with some sort of appraisal waiver or some sort of appraisal gap coverage. Now, the way the loan works, it's based on the lowest of the appraised value or the purchase price. So if you're doing a 20% down loan, when you get in the contract, it's going to be based on the purchase price. Now, if that home does not appraise at the purchase price, that new 20% down loan program is now based on the appraised value. So if you must put 20% down in order to buy that home, you need to come up with a cash differential to cover that gap, known as the appraisal gap, in order to proceed with that purchase. So if you're sitting in a position where you have lots of cash available, your debt to income ratio is fairly low, and obviously this is something that your agent, yourself, and a lender all needs to be, in cahoots, in sync with, and having a conversation about to know your limits, then potentially you can make an offer on a home with no appraisal contingency. You can waive the appraisal contingency. And a lot of folks are doing that, especially if they're putting 30% down or something like that, because while you may intend on putting 20% down, you may only need to put 5% down to get the actual loan to go through. So that gives you a lot of room to cover any sort of low appraisal. The other thing that folks are doing is saying, well, hey, I have limited amount of resources. I only have X amount of cash available. So after running the numbers with their lender, and we talk about it in detail, then we come up with a number that said, hey, we can cover a $10,000 appraisal gap. We can cover a $50,000 appraisal gap, whatever that number may be. But it's based on the cash that you have available, and your lender signing off on those numbers because he has to run the whole scenario and make sure it all works and it still pencils out. And then you being okay with all of those numbers. And then we put that actual verbiage, buyer will cover an appraisal gap of X amount up to a maximum of the purchase price if the home doesn't appraise at the full purchase price. And what does that do? So basically now, if I have 10 offers in and they're all above the listed price, but only 3 of them have some sort of appraisal gap coverage or appraisal waiver, now I'm no longer looking at any of them as a seller that don't have that included, because now I'm looking at, okay, what will my home likely appraise for? And now if you don't have any sort of appraisal gap coverage or a waiver of the appraisal, then the purchase price that you offer really doesn't mean anything, because once it appraises at whatever value it appraises at, then we're going to be back to the table having a conversation trying to get the purchase price to come down to that new number. And if you have someone else that offered above that number, and they offered a appraisal waiver, or they offered a coverage of a $20,000 appraisal gap, well, now that offer is going to be much more attractive than any offer that didn't come with an appraisal waiver or appraisal gap coverage. So that's how that process works. So it's very important for you to understand that on both the buying and selling side. And if you're on the buyer side, it's very important that you're working closely with your lender and your real estate agent so the math is done, you know the numbers ahead of time, and the appropriate verbiage is put into your purchase contract to help you win that deal. The last contingency that I want to talk about is specifically put in place for the seller, and it's a contingency to allow the seller to find a suitable replacement property before they're obligated to selling this home. And what that means is that if you're a seller and you're looking to buy another house, but before you close the escrow of the one that you're selling, you want to make sure that you have got your next house under contract. Then you put that in place. You put that contingency in place, which now gives you an exit from the contract as a seller, because guess what? The buyer has standard contingencies in the contract, the seller does not. So this is the only contingency that the seller can put into the contract that will allow them to exit the contract and not get into a legal battle because they no longer want to sell their home. So that's a very important contingency that any seller that's thinking about potentially buying another house and they need to sell this house in order to buy that next house should be considering. There's some pros and cons to putting that in place, and there's other ways to go about executing a sale and then purchase transaction that may be a little bit more suitable to this market. But if you're risk adverse, this is definitely a contingency that you should understand and you may want to consider and put in place. Now, on the flip side, as a buyer, you need to understand that if that seller has that contingency in place and they cannot find their next home, you may not be buying this house when it's all said and done. So that's very important for you to understand. So anyway, if you have any questions about contingencies, purchase contracts, real estate in general, the market, whatever it may be, reach out, give me a call. And of course, if you know anyone, friends, family, loved ones, etc., co-workers, whoever it may be that's thinking about selling a property or buying a property, I want to talk to you about that. Would love to chat with you about that. All of my contact information will follow this video. So please reach out and give me a call. I look forward to speaking with you. Take care.